I started measuring this in the operating room by putting electrodes to measure brain waves on a person's forehead. And I would do it starting from the time that they were awake and aware. And then I would map the entire process of them becoming a little bit drowsy and then fully losing consciousness and then re-emerging back to their aware state. And so in this process, I've been able to watch brains dissolve and then to reassemble. We can now revert adult cells to an almost fetal state where they can become anything. And we have started growing spherical organoids in dishes. And one of the organs we can now grow in a dish in a very basic fashion are brains. So we can grow brains in a dish. What if we grow brains that become sufficiently complex that they can begin to express some of these types of electrical activity, which they have started to do? Could we ever build a brain in a dish that could express consciousness? Another interesting question is, this is something that Hinduism looks at, when an organism dies, does its consciousness die with it? Or does its consciousness persist? If you were looking at it from, more of a Hindu perspective, a Vedanta perspective, you might say, yes, the Atman persists. If you look at it from a science perspective or a neuroscience perspective, how would you describe that? And you might describe this as saying that there is an information trace that persists.
Namaste everyone. Welcome to Yes Talks. The title of today's talk is Sculpting Consciousness, How the Brain Tunes into a Conscious Universe. Our guest speaker with us today is Dr. Divya Chander. Dr. Divya is a Harvard, Stanford, UCSF, UCSD-trained physician, neuroscientist, neuroethicist, futurist, and entrepreneur. She is a practicing anesthesiologist and founder CEO of Lucidify, a brain-computer interface platform for the detection of delirium and other altered states of consciousness to support brain health and cognitive longevity. Dr. Chander's expertise in neural signal processing has led to her developing mind-reading algorithms to automate tracking of states of consciousness. Her research interests center around mapping consciousness, how consciousness will be altered by human augmentation, and how mapping consciousness in humans may enable us to recognize it in non-human intelligent beings. She serves as medical, science, and technology advisor and board member to a number of companies in the medical, space life sciences, and neurotechnology spaces. Hi, ma'am. Welcome, Divya, ma'am. We are so honored to have you with us today on the Yes platform. Thank you so much for joining.
Yes, no problem. So I will then share my screen, and let's see if it takes just a moment to make sure that it's sharing properly. Okay, so this talk is going to be at the intersection, really, of science and spirituality, and it's not meant to replace anyone's sort of personal view of or their experience of what consciousness is. But it is an interesting way of looking at it from the perspective of neuroscience. So we'll start there. Hi, everybody. I'm Divya Chander. I'm basically a physician and a neuroscientist. And even though I'm quite grounded in what you would say is very hard sciences, I have always been interested in exploring this question of consciousness since I was a very, very young girl, actually. And so my way of doing so was to combine my medical profession and my scientific profession. And so from a phenomenological perspective, we are going to start here. which is actually a quote from Sir Isaac Newton. And what he said was, "To determineth by what modes or actions light produceth in our minds the phantasm of color is not so easy." And this is actually in Western philosophy what they call the hard problem of consciousness. So if all of us were to be looking at the same scene, if we were all to be looking at an apple, we might be receiving wavelengths to our eye of light of 670 nanometers, and we all call that red. But is my red the same red that you perceive, right? So when my brain binds this image, do I actually have the same phenomenological perception that my consciousness has created that you do? So again, this has been called the hard problem of consciousness, and there was a neurophilosopher who actually coined that term. His name is David Chalmers. He's based in Australia. Okay, so part of the problem here is that it is very difficult to define what consciousness is. So, how do you create experiments around this to measure these things? There is a different way to approach this problem, and this is where my background comes in. So, what we can do is we can look at what depressed states of consciousness actually have in common, whether those states are sleep or drug-induced anesthesia, delirium, or coma. And this helps us get around this problematic issue of a precise definition, because most of us would agree that in these different states, whether or not you and I can agree upon what consciousness is, it seems to be diminished in these particular situations. And so, specifically as an anesthesiologist, we manipulate human consciousness. This is what we do for a living. We use our anesthetic drugs. And the central target of our anesthetic drugs, the things that make surgery possible, is actually something we call the central nerve axis. It's our brain, it's our spinal cord. And these drugs basically, once they enter your system, they make you blissfully unaware of the surgeon's knife. Yes, this is how modern surgery is possible. And when surgery is over, we wash these drugs out of your system and we watch consciousness reassemble itself without damaging your brain. So this is actually a very, very special mystery that we have access to. So here is one of the ways in which I mapped this. I started measuring this in the operating room by putting electrodes, so basically little electrical stickers to measure brain waves on a person's forehead. And I would do it starting from the time that they were awake and aware. And then I would map the entire process of them becoming a little bit drowsy and then fully losing consciousness and then re-emerging back to their aware state. And so in this process, I've been able to watch brains dissolve and then to reassemble. And so this enables me to look a little bit at what is different about those underlying circuits. But this doesn't actually explain what I have learned under anesthesia, how consciousness arises in the first place. And I want to make that very clear. And the big question that has sort of, I would say, put perhaps scientists and spiritual seekers, even of many traditions, at a little bit of odds is, does consciousness emerge from these neural networks, or is it something else? Is it something ineffable? Another question that arises is that if we could somehow create an artificial simulacrum of the brain, so if we could somehow capture every single nerve cell and every single connection between those nerve cells, could we, in building this simulation, would this thing that we have created produce this phenomenon that we had identified as consciousness? And I will say that people have been trying to do this for a very, very long time. But currently, with the advent of computational power and artificial intelligence and our ability to map the brain at very high fidelity, this is the first time that scientists have embarked upon simulations of the brain that are really beginning to approximate what organic brains are like. So this is a very, very interesting time that way for neuroscience. But even as a neuroscientist, I am going to posit to you that consciousness is not produced by the brain. And it may be something that we access in the universe. And the way I look at it, not phenomenologically, not when I am meditating, but as a scientist, I would call consciousness potentially something, a description of the total information available to us from the physical universe. And it is received and filtered and perceived by our brain rather than generated by our brain. It is perceived by our brain. And so that final conscious percept is therefore a result of the brain reducing and optimizing the total information available to us for our survival. So I'm going to give you a correlate, and that is the visual system. So we're going to use this as our analogy. So when we as humans look out at the universe, what we are actually perceiving is a very narrow slice of the electromagnetic spectrum. That's the rainbow that we see. And this rainbow that we see, and you can see here this very narrow slice of this visual spectrum, this is actually based upon the color photoreceptors that we have. So we have 3 color photoreceptors, and the light waves that we are able to bind are limited physiologically by those color photoreceptors. Now, if we looked at a different animal, actually a mantis shrimp, for instance, that lives on the coral reef, this animal has many more color receptors. And on that coral reef, it is able to perceive a much wider swath of color. So it has 12 photoreceptors. We have 3. It has 12. And as a result, what the mantis shrimp sees is a rainbow from not just from red to indigo, but it actually sees a rainbow from deep, deep red, almost infrared, well into the ultraviolet. Okay, so it has a much larger perception than the human eye, as you can see. So it binds more of the rainbow. But interestingly, we form a conscious visual perception from this, right? This is what happens. We actually, our eye is throwing out, as you can see, almost all of the available information in that natural world. Our brain is now filtering the rest, and then it goes from the eye through multiple regions of the brain, and then it ends up in the back of the brain in a part of the brain called the visual cortex. And the visual perception that we produce as humans, we think it is so rich. It is such an impoverished and almost hallucinated version of the total information available to us from the universe. Nevertheless, the information that we do see allows us to survive, and quite successfully, yes, in our ecological niche, right? So in this analogy, we would not say that our brain essentially produces that visual spectrum. That visual spectrum is a property of the universe, not of our brain, but the percept is produced in our brain. So to some extent, we can say our perception begins in the world, but it ends in our mind. And that is the analogy, that is the way we might be able to look at this property of consciousness as a perceived quality of the universe versus the total of available information in that universe. So another really interesting point to mention, and this gets very physicsy, but in order to begin to even wrap your mind around how much information is available in the universe, and now we're not even talking about things like parallel universes, string theory, etc., but just the physical universe that we are able to measure. There was a physicist named Seth Lloyd from MIT, and he calculated the total number of bits available in the universe by imagining the universe as one big black hole with an event horizon. And he said, well, how much information would there have to be? 10 to the 90th bits, that is more than all the grains of sand on the earth. It is more than all of the stars that we can actually measure in our known universe. It is that big. And here's the thing. Let's go back to that visual system analogy. If our brain were to try and receive and bind and transmit and process all 10 to the 90th bits of information in the universe, and turn it into some kind of a signature that we could perceive, it would just burn out metabolically. We would not be capable of doing that. And this is why organisms with brains, organisms like us with a nervous system, we produce this very reduced set of neural networks that produces a very impoverished hallucination of the physical world in order for us to survive in our ecological niche. And in the brain of organisms where we measure that, what that looks like, that signal, that is what we call the EEG, the electroencephalogram, because we can actually measure. This is what I was measuring in my patient. I have a device here. This is, that we peel and stick to the forehead. This picks up electrical signals in microvolts coming from the surface of the brain. That is the end result of a nervous system, an organic nervous system, trying to make sense of the amount of information available in the universe. So this is a close-up of one of the monitors that I used in the operating room. And you can see that it covers this particular area of the forehead. We can use much higher density ones as well that cover everything. And these squiggles that you see here are the electrical information coming from the brain. And once I process these pieces of information offline, I can make correlations to what your brain is doing at multiple levels of consciousness. And then I can write algorithms. So let's look at a few interesting observations now that come from measuring the neural correlates of consciousness under anesthesia. Okay, so the first thing I will tell you is that anesthetics at clinically relevant doses, so that means the amount of anesthesia I need to give you to reduce or remove your conscious awareness so you don't notice the surgery happening around you. It doesn't abolish that electrical activity in the brain at all. So all of those squiggles that I showed you here in this slide over here, they still exist. They're still happening in the brain. We haven't made the brain electrically quiet. So what's happening instead? What's actually happening is that the ability for the brain to calculate information based upon all of that electrical activity within our brain, that has been really markedly reduced. The other thing that happens under anesthesia is that we dissolve the connections in the brain. This is a dynamical process, so it's not like the brain is physically changing itself. What is happening is that right now, as all of us are together in conversation, this part of our brain and this part of our brain and this part of our brain, as we're trying to process the information coming in, they're all interacting with us and they're all very functionally connected. But as we get sleepy and drowsy, those parts of our brain will begin to break apart and the connections will not be so strong. And by the time you are anesthetized, those connections are incredibly weak. And this is part of the reason that information is coming in from the peripheral universe. So it can still come in through your eyes. It can still come in through your ears. So for instance, if I were to play tones to one of my patients on an operating room table, we would notice that their auditory cortex, so the part of the brain that first picks up sound, it still responds to sound, but the brain doesn't form a perception of the sound. So the part of the brain that binds the information, that's no longer functioning online. And so what we could say is that anesthetics are actually modifying the brain's filtering and processing power. And therefore, it now enables us to ask some very interesting questions about what David Chalmers called that hard problem of consciousness. So one question is, can artificial brains ever become conscious? And again, for people in your audience, and since some of you have a very strong medical background, we can now take stem cells, right? So let's say I were to take a skin cell or a fat cell and put it into a dish and put chemical factors in it. We can now revert adult cells to an almost fetal state where they can become anything. And we have started growing spherical organoids in dishes. And one of the organs we can now grow in a dish in a very basic fashion are brains. So we can grow brains in a dish. What if we grow brains that become sufficiently complex that they can begin to express some of these types of electrical activity, which they have started to do? Could we ever build a brain in a dish that could express consciousness? Because they are now sufficiently complex to access some of the information available in the universe, right? So again, we go back to this, there is so much information available into the universe. What do we do? How much of it can we bind? Another interesting question is, this is something that Hinduism looks at, when an organism dies, does its consciousness die with it? Or does its consciousness persist? And if you were looking at it from, more of a Hindu perspective, a Vedanta perspective, you might say, yes, the Atman persists. If you look at it from a science perspective or a neuroscience perspective, how would you describe that? And you might describe this as saying that there is an information trace that persists, much as the visual spectrum, that electromagnetic spectrum, that outlasts the organic visual system that perceived it and turned it into a visual percept. In the same way, in organic neural network, once the organism that hosts it ceases to exist, is the information that was hosted by it, does it persist, right? And if it persists, we're getting a bit metaphysical here, but this is what is called in this parlance non-local consciousness. So consciousness that is only local stays with the organism, okay? A non-local consciousness, if the organism dies, that consciousness can be moved around. Now in Hinduism and Buddhism, we would call that reincarnation. If you were, in today's world, an artificial intelligence researcher, you would actually say, well, I can build a simulacrum of a brain, and I can take that information trace, and I can actually move it from something organic into something inorganic. Yes, I can take this and I could maybe imbue a brain organoid or a humanoid robot, right? They can all share this kind of information. I mean, it might sound disturbing, but this is what they are trying to look at. And I will also, it may be worth stopping for a moment, but just a couple of more slides before we have a discussion around this. This is an example, actually, of what I pulled out of the brain of somebody who is being anesthetized. I can actually plot the entire course of their brain in color over the course of an anesthetic. So this is 3 hours. And what you see on the y-axis is the frequencies of the brain in hertz. So this is the number of times a sine wave moves per second. And across this x-axis here, this is the total time of the surgery. And when we are awake, there is a lot of broadband activity from the very low to the very high frequencies. But when somebody loses consciousness because I give them an anesthetic drug, a lot of the high frequencies drop out. And the red colors here mean there's a lot of a particular frequency, and the blue means it's gone. And you can see at about 0 to 4 hertz and 10 hertz, there are these 2 red lines that begin to march along in the brain. It is the Goldilocks zone of the brain under anesthesia. These 2 oscillations in your brain mean that your brain is blocking the formation of perceptions in response to the outside world. So if the surgeon cuts you with a knife to do surgery, your periphery will still sense it, but your brain will make no sense of it centrally because of these oscillations. And then when we wash the anesthetic out of the brain like this, you can actually see the high frequencies are even coming back. And this is what we call spectral processing. But I mentioned to you the functional connectivity of brains, which also changes under anesthesia. And I even mentioned to you that the brain calculates less information. And in the work that I did as a scientist, I did one more thing. We even used nonlinear dynamics to track those changes from just a few electrodes on the forehead. And it turns out that if you're sleeping, the squiggles look very similar to the squiggles when you are under anesthesia. But I can't cut into you when you're sleeping. You'll notice. You're like, wait. But if you're under anesthesia, your ability to form the perception is completely blocked. So what we did is we took this information and we did something different. We calculated chaotic attractors. For those of you who, again, are immersed a bit into science, what we did was we tried to use a way of looking at a brain state in 3 dimensions that reflected how rich the information was in the brain. And when you are awake, your brain traces out a full sphere. And as your brain becomes more sedated, it begins to shrink a little bit into a cigar shape. And you see this basically under sleep. And then as you become more and more anesthetized and you enter the Goldilocks zone, your brain shrinks into a pencil. And then finally, if you're too anesthetized, your brain turns into a tiny little point. So this is using a Greek term called entropy to actually calculate how rich the amount of information is in the brain, how much information, how much surprise, how much uncertainty, how many potential outcomes there are. And we can go back and actually look at that spectral processing and see that this person, when they were awake, their brain was more like a sphere. It had more potential. And then as they became anesthetized, it became more like a cigar and then a pencil. And then as I washed the anesthetic out of their brain, it went back in the other direction. So there is one more interesting thing we can do. We can look at different states of consciousness. So I told you in the beginning, we use things like sleep and anesthesia and coma as model systems to understand. But what if we were to add things like meditation? Can we actually see how these states of consciousness modify these metrics in the brain? And it turns out if you take an experienced meditator, for instance, they have taken Buddhist monks and put them in fMRI machines or recorded electrical activity, the connections in their brain are altered. The electrical activity in their brain is altered. And actually, the ability for their brain to express this richness of information states also changes. And if you look at entropy in meditators, often that complexity and richness of signals is increased. It's increased. So that in itself is a very, very interesting finding. Another finding is psychedelics. For those of you who've heard that these can actually induce tremendously almost spiritual states where people feel like that they're communing with the love in the universe. If you look at the entropy in these states too, that richness of the signal, it's also increased. And when I say increased, I mean increased relative to waking. And this increased possibility that the brain can occupy different states is part of why both meditation and psychedelics increase what we call plasticity in the brain. The ability of the brain, instead of moving down a worn pathway, you put one input and the same output always comes out. Our brains form habits of thinking as well. This is why you can use it for things like therapy or people who have PTSD, where you can take an input and move it through a brain that has been exposed either to meditation or a psychedelic and get a different output because the richness and complexity of the signal has changed. The ability of the signal produced by the brain now has more pathways it can go down. And so I actually plotted a two-dimensional plot now of consciousness, looking at many different brain states to see how complex and rich they were and how integrated and coherent they were, how much they could actually synchronize across brain regions. And as you see, coma, which is very close to brain death, has very little complexity in the signal, and it's very poorly integrated. And waking has a high degree of complexity and a high degree of integration and coherence. But look, meditation, it has more integration and coherence than the waking state. And it actually depends upon the type of meditation you practice. The dreaming state is very interesting, right? In the dreaming state, your brain is generating an entirely complex series of perceptions, but your level of consciousness is pretty low. And so the integration and coherence is not very high in the brain. Oh, but its complexity is very, very rich. And psychedelics do this to an even more extreme level. This is in this upper left quadrant. This is the sleeping state. This is the anesthetized state. Very low complexity, very synchronous. Your brain looks here like it looks here. It's not calculating information. And then the state that I work on today clinically and that my company is working to capture is delirium. It's another state of consciousness where the brain is breaking down. And we do it because older brains are very vulnerable to this. And we want to make sure we capture it before their brains fail. So I'm going to end with two crazy slides. This is the idea that we've been looking at the brain as a quantum mechanical, it's a classical tool, but the universe also has quantum mechanical properties, yes, including electromagnetic, everything in our physical universe can be described by classical physics or by quantum physics. Does the brain have any quantum properties itself? And does the brain form conscious perceptions based on quantum processing? And this is merely to say that if the brain is producing consciousness on a quantum mechanical level, what that might imply and what this particular hypothesis implies, and by the way, Hammeroff here is an anesthesiologist like myself who became very interested in the problem of consciousness from the perspective of anesthesia. Roger Penrose is a quantum physicist, and he won the Nobel Prize actually for physics. And together they came up with this idea that in the brain, what may be happening is that there are a number of possible perceptions coming in from a lot of media. So your eyes, your ears, your sense, all your different senses. And just like in quantum mechanics, where a photon of light can be basically discrete or it can have a waveform, these different perceptions in your brain can have these different forms. But when you finally form the conscious perception, they collapse into a single percept. So quantum mechanics causes the collapse of a wave function in your brain. And that's how consciousness is produced. And then there is an opposite way to look at this, which is that consciousness begins with this superposition of all these potential quantum states. And the more quantum states that exist, the more exponentially rich your perceptions will be. But I'm going to go back to that thing I mentioned at the very, very beginning. I myself perceive that it is actually the universe that is conscious, conscious with a big C. In what we as organisms that are incarnated in this physical form, this exquisite gift of a physical form do, is that we use these neural networks to bind that information, that consciousness, and create a very small piece of that so we can survive in our ecological niche. And those of us who are maybe practitioners on a spiritual journey, what we do temporarily is, for instance, through the practice of meditation, is we reorder this filter. Psychedelics, anesthetics are drugs that create brute force changes in those connections. But through meditation, we do it through our own practice. And through this practice, we are potentially able to have a greater experience of that consciousness that is available to us in the universe. We are somewhat limited in human form for fully experiencing that. But meditation is a way that we can access and bind some more of that information. So I will sort of stop here with that introduction, and we have, I think, lots of time to talk. So, and I'm happy to also stop sharing my screen. So, let's. Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you so much, Divya ma'am, for a very inspiring and thought provoking session. We are truly grateful that you shared your insight and clarity, and of course, the curiosity you have brought up in all of us today. Thank you so much. And we already have some participants to ask or maybe share something. So, Pankaj Ji had raised the hand first. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very stimulating and very informative talk, and this topic has been of a lot of interest to me. I'm a physician with critical care and sleep background, so and
Oh, wow, we
also
should talk.
a lot of
That's what I do.
absolutely. And I have a lot of interest in Vedanta and Hinduism, and this topic has been of tremendous interest. So I found your talk very enlightening. But I have a couple of comments and then a question or invite your comment. One, I feel sometimes that the language and the words we use are probably not sufficient to describe some of these concepts and can also cause some element of confusion in terms of using consciousness and awareness and what that describes and how it's perceived in layperson's language. It sort of creates a little bit of confusion. And be that as it may, your discussion about states of consciousness was very interesting, but I would like for you to give your thoughts or comments on another situation that I came across. I'm here in Michigan, so in cold weather, we have situations where people go ice fishing on lakes when they get frozen, and often they end up um, breaking through the ice and drowning, and are rescued and they are brought in, and oftentimes they come in to the emergency room, and for all intents and purposes, they have no vital signs, and the EEG also is a flat line, but they are not pronounced dead until you warm them up. And when you warm them up, some of them then start showing EEG activity and the vital signs recover. And I've always been intrigued in these discussions. How do you sort of look at something like this in terms of when the person comes in, their physical, I mean, as you described in anesthesia, there is still some degree of electrical activity in these patients and these people. There is no electrical activity of the brain when they come in, and still some of them will come around when you warm, some would not. And how do you, what's your comment, or how do you uh, perceive, these scenarios as another kind of state of consciousness? I'll let you
Um,
speak, and then I may have one more
yeah, no, no,
question later.
absolutely. I'm going to ask you another question because this is one of those very interesting edge cases that we get to encounter in clinical medicine that enable us to ask some of these probing questions about what it actually means to be conscious. Have you ever had the experience as you warm these patients that they have actually had what one considers either to be a near-death experience or an out-of-body experience?
I personally have not, but I think other people have described. I might have, read it in other places, but I don't have personal experience of that.
So there's a very interesting book called Erasing Death. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's by a physician named Sam Parnea, and I think he's an emergency room physician. I'll put the link in the chat for everybody. But he specifically was a researcher in resuscitation medicine. So this experience that you described where it seems that somebody's vital signs make them look like they are almost on the verge of death. But we are able to, with our clinical medicine, now bring them back. And that's especially common in people who are, like you mentioned, drowning in cold water because they're cooled, or if we artificially cool them, because they've had a heart attack or a myocardial infarction or something of that nature. And he started getting a lot of stories about people having very conserved experiences, this experience of seeing a light and being in a field of very, very connected love and things of that nature. Many of them would see relatives, etc. There was another subset of people who actually might go through an experience like that. And as you know, we might put someone like this on a ventilator for a bit as we are slowly warming them in order to conserve their respiratory muscle strength until they're back. And some of those people reported literally what sounded like out of body experiences, right? They would report things that they had heard in another room. And he said, I am a very, he's like, I'm an atheist. I'm a very, very scientific person. And after a while, I could not ignore the experiences that were happening. So I would say two things. One, an experience getting very close to the brain flatlining. We basically can do that with anesthetics. I record EEG in all my patients, and when you take and you probably will understand this term, but when we deliver enough anesthetic to the brain that it's not in the Goldilocks zone that I showed, but the brain enters a space called burst suppression. What that looks like in a brain, even in a living person who's on my ventilator, is that you see the brain's activity is flat, 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 and then there's a tiny bit of a squiggle, and the squiggle is that electrical activity, and the flat lines are the silence. And we can stretch those out longer and longer and longer till there are very, very few periods of any electrical activity whatsoever. And they come back, don't they? So I think the interesting question is where where does our consciousness go, so to speak? Is it still being hosted by our brain? Is it wandering somewhere else? Is it and another very interesting feature, and you'll probably find this in these drowning victims who come back, or in my case, in people who are very deeply anesthetized, the ability to sequence time is gone. And if they're under anesthesia for 5 minutes or they're under anesthesia for, 2 days, it seems as if no time has passed to them. And is this idea of being able to sequence time also an important thing? From a medical standpoint, we would simply say that what we have done is we have protected the underlying neural networks in the host organism. And as long as we can rekindle that electrical activity and the physical connections in the brain, the connectome, have persisted, we can bring any brain back to host consciousness again. And if you believe in a very reductionistic view, you would say, well, it's an active brain that basically produces consciousness as an emergent property. And from the perspective that I hold, I actually think that when the brain is that deeply cooled, what's really happening is that because the electrical activity has ceased, the brain has stopped calculating information. It has an incredibly low entropy. The entropy would look very close to brain death. And it essentially is not functionally connected any longer. But I don't actually believe consciousness has gone away. I just think you've reordered the brain's filter, and that the information trace that is our conscious awareness, that has persisted, and that if you can revive an organism that can host it, it will continue to do so until that connection is severed. I don't know that that's a satisfactory explanation. I could definitely, with the metrics we use, define what's happening in that brain that has been cooled. But that doesn't still get us at that problem of what it means to be conscious. But from the limited experiences that some of these resuscitation medicine doctors have shared, it really does appear that even in Western medicine, you might be able to argue that consciousness is non-local, that it can move around. It can perceive things outside the body, especially when a lot of the brain circuits are shut down.
Yes, thank you. That was nice, and I do subscribe to this view, although I'm open-minded in that regard. Are you familiar with Dr. Tanoni's view from
I have actually spoken.
Wisconsin?
Yes, I know him well, actually.
So
And
what's your take on his view on the emergence of consciousness?
Tanoni's view, which is also shared by Christoph Koch, is that consciousness is an emergent property of brains. And he's one of the people who mathematically formalized what's
Yes.
known as the information integration theory of consciousness. So the one, when I presented that slide that actually showed integration, they actually have basically a metric which they call psi, and that captures the total amount of information a brain can integrate. And in that theory, what you see is that, in fact, Tanoni, one of his model systems was sleep. His wife is actually a sleep researcher. And the other model system they use, and they collaborate with anesthesiologists like myself. And what they found is that through the succession of these different states of consciousness, the brain just basically calculates less information. And in my opinion, it's a very elegant way of capturing the computationally, and finding a metric for what it means to move through these different levels of consciousness. What they don't do is, and then what this theory does is it doesn't address what happens phenomenologically when someone is meditating and really potentially accessing other kinds of consciousness in the universe. It has no explanation for this kind of phenomenological effect, but it's very good at capturing something very physical and neuroscience-y, you could say.
Yes. I did happen to see Dr. Tanoni in one of the sleep meetings a few years ago and discuss some of these issues, and it was very interesting, his take on it. I appreciate your answer and your time and comments, and I have to run, but I'll look at the rest of the meeting on the recording. But if we have a way to connect with you later or
I put
contact
my email address in the chat, so if you want to grab that, I'm working clinically on sleep and delirium and coma, and so if that's also something
this
of interest.
It's a lot of interest, yes, and if we have a way to connect, that would be great. And just before I leave, where are you based in?
San Francisco.
Okay, very good. Great, I appreciate it. Thank you very much for your.
Thank you, and just copy my you can just copy my email from the chat. So
sounds good. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's three questions.
Kritika ji has raised the hand. Please go ahead.
Yes.
Hello, this is Kritika. I am doing
None
research.
of you want to come up. Would you guys be willing to come onto camera while we talk? It's just easier. Thank you. It's so it's so nice to see your face.
Thank you. This is Kritika. I am doing research. I've recently joined this research in IIT Madras. I'm at a very initial stage. It's been only first few months, and I'm doing research on consciousness studies based on Advait Vedanta, and I also aim to relate it to neurology, which is an upcoming branch, neurophilosophy, these days. So right now at this stage, I'm trying to figure out very basic things. For example, what consciousness is understood in different theories. For example, if I take it in terms of Advaita Vedanta, I see it as Satchidanand. So, for example, you've given an explanation of how consciousness is very limited at the dream stage, while there are a lot of activities going on. How do you interpret this measurement of consciousness? Because to interpret this measurement of consciousness, do we not need to know what consciousness exactly is understood? I know that it is very complicated thing, but while writing down any article, I often struggle to understand what consciousness is particularly understood in different theories. So I wanted an insight on this.
Well, that's actually precisely why I've approached it from the perspective that I have. And that's because even in the absence of a theory or a definition, because by the way, every definition, there is a violation. Some people think it's like, for instance, self-awareness. Well, you take a person who's had a parietal stroke, which is part of their brain, and they actually lose awareness and perception of one half of their body. Some people think it's the mirror test, the ability to recognize oneself. You take a baby, a human baby, and you give them a mirror, and they don't recognize themselves. Are they not conscious? Right? In fact, if you take a dolphin or an elephant baby and you give them the mirror test, they can recognize themselves, and they do it in terms of neurological development before the human baby does. Are they more conscious? Lots of violations. Everything is a violation. So it's very helpful to do what I described in the beginning, which is to take states that we agree reflect diminished levels of consciousness, and before we define what they are, we look at what they have in common. So you take the sleeping brain, you take the comatose brain, you take an anesthetized brain, and you either measure their electrical activity, you put them in the scanner, and you come up with all the metrics. You can describe consciousness as basically a higher level of information calculating ability. You could describe consciousness as a higher degree of functional connectivity. You could describe consciousness as a higher degree of entropy, rich possible states that the brain could occupy. These particular definitions don't come out of the spiritual traditions as much, but there is some overlap, right? Because if you were to talk to somebody phenomenologically that has had an experience of the states of consciousness available in the universe, they will tell you it is a state where there is a much richer repertoire of information available than what we normally experience. Would they not? And it's almost like we can almost give a mathematical definition to what's happening in the underlying neural networks that's able to interact or interface with the more spiritual philosophical traditions, as in Vedanta. And I have a spiritual practice. I have been meditating since I was about probably 16, on and off, but recently in the last couple of years, every day. And I have experiences which are very, very unlike my normal waking state. And I sometimes I wear this and I measure what my brain is doing. I have electrical signatures in my brain of those states. And so I would say that you can, if you are looking at neurophilosophical definitions within your research program, what you can do simply is to say when one is experiencing these states, is there a neural correlate? You can just measure it. That's what we do. We measure in the meditators when they're meditating. Just measure it. And then you can find a metric, and then you can, begin to understand according to some of these definitions.
So maybe can we say that maybe consciousness does not exactly has a definition. It just has different parameters in different states. Some of the parameters are fulfilled while in others they are not. Because again, in state which the previous questioner had mentioned, that frozen state where there is no activity actually going on, yet we do not declare it dead, still there is consciousness. So we basically don't know a particular definition of consciousness, but different parameters which may hint towards consciousness, something like that.
I would say, sure, you can do that, but there is a lot of value to looking at these edge cases, right? Essentially, if you take a person whose body is alive, but they appear to be brain dead, and then you look at a person who's fully awake and aware, and you look at the differences between these two states, there's a lot of rich information in there. And then that place where the person is on the verge of complete death, but they're not dead yet, because we can revive them with our clinical science. Let's say the body does not survive. Now what happens to its consciousness? And you might argue it expands, right? Maybe it was being limited by this organic. I mean, essentially, if you believe in these various philosophies, for instance, Vedanta, your consciousness is this huge, expansive thing. And once it's in human form, it becomes completely limited, right? And it becomes limited because how would you survive if you were constantly in this completely samadhi state all the time, right? Would not work. This organism would do nothing all day, right? It would just be connecting to the universe, the entire universe. So I would argue that there is an ecological and evolutionary imperative for an organism to reduce its level of consciousness to something that can be contained and make it functional. And that we have these opportunities through experiencing altered consciousness, whether it is through meditation and spiritual practice or psychedelics, to experience these much larger expanded states. And so I would encourage you to look at the edge cases, and find those neural correlates. And you can look at the edge cases in each of these philosophical traditions, and you can also look at the edge cases in these clinical medical conditions and see what they have in common.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a couple of more questions. I would precise it if time permits. So, while going through these, I also think about hallucination. I do not particularly aim to integrate into my research project, but this is
Kritika,
just, yeah.
Kritika, as you said, if there's time, then you'll ask more questions.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there is no time because there are a few other people who have raised their hands. What you can do is you can note down Divya's email address. She said she'll put it in the chat so you can communicate directly. And uh, Arunima will put down my email address too, or the Yes Spirituality email. So you can contact us either. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Anshuji had raised the hand next. Please go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you so much again, Arunamaji. So they were very interesting. A couple of clarifying questions. If you would be willing to share, I think you mentioned there are differences in different meditation traditions. I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit on that. And then you mentioned something about accessing non-ordinary states in your own practice. If you would be kind enough to elaborate on that, I'd be very grateful.
Yeah, so I have not written the papers on the different meditation traditions. There are some scientists actually who focus on this kind of thing. All I could do is potentially offer a list of different types of, papers where one can actually read some of these different philosophies. There's, for instance, I'm trying to think if I have. So, for instance, there's a type of meditation called Vipassana meditation, where you observe your thoughts, but you don't engage with them. And what you see in that particular state is an incredibly large amount of an increase in entropy, which is complexity and richness of signal. But the brain is also very, very coherent. It's very synchronized in a fast frequency band of the brain. So that might be a little bit too much information. There are other kinds of meditation which show shifts in entropy or complexity, but they don't show the same change in coherence. And so the point there is simply that when you are asking your brain to do certain kinds of things in meditation, either to focus or to completely detach, or just to, let your thoughts sort of pass over you like waves, these things actually have slightly different effects on the connected networks in the brain. Ultimately, and if you are also a practitioner and you've tried these many types of meditation, you'll find that, ultimately your practice might feel different while you're trying these different forms of meditation, but ultimately you come to the same state, which is a deeper sense of awareness of the self. Yes. And so these metrics are interesting, but they're not as interesting as the phenomenological connection. You asked about my own practice, and in my own practice, I have very strong experiences of my subtle body. So I have very energetic experiences. So I actually feel parts of my body almost dissolving like electricity. And I've been having this since I was a very young kid, actually 15 or 16. And I also, I can sense alternate. It's very difficult to put words in English to describe these things, but you can feel things that feel both. You feel incredibly grounded, but very, very spacious. You lose a little bit of a sense of where your physical body ends. So the kind of body awareness that we usually have moving through our waking life, many times that seems to go. You also have a much deeper sense of, I would say, what is a construction of your mind, which I relate to the body. So what is this incarnation doing, and what sort of karmic habits of thought does it tend to engage in all the time? And you can distinguish that actually from what it's just like to be. And so you have a taste of what it's like not to exist in a state where you're constantly contaminated by, your samskaras or your karmic habits. Actually, it's quite useful from a psychological perspective, because it's not like you forget what this was about. And so you're able to maybe bring some of that change in habit of thinking to your waking life, and break some habits that you may have. But most generally, it's a very interesting experience of a kind of expansion and feeling almost like you're floating, and also a complete groundedness, and a loss sometimes of the physical sensations of the body, and a very, very deep sense of peace. So, and I have a lot of difficulty putting into words what my experience has been. So,
Thank you so much for that attempt. Thank you.
of course.
Viswaranjanji had raised the hand.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for the interesting talk. So I have one question regarding the psychedelics. So the effects of like psychedelic altering the states of consciousness, is this reversible, or how long it takes for changing the like consciousness for different types of psychedelics?
It is completely dependent on which one, because they have very, very different effects. There's a very, very powerful one called 5-MeO-DMT, which literally obliterates your sense of your physical body and almost throws you into something called that's very similar to a samadhi state. Most people describe it as being merged with a godlike consciousness, and that lasts 5 to 10 minutes max, right? If you took psilocybin, which are mushrooms, it's dose dependent, the length. Again, it's incredibly dependent upon the particular medication, and it's also dependent upon the setting in which you do it. I don't particularly think that they are as interesting or healing when people do them recreationally, but when people do them in a container of a spiritual practice with a shaman, with a guide, or if they do it in a psychiatric therapeutic setting, it can be a very, very different experience. Almost all of them have in common plasticity. And in fact, if you took some of these, like for instance, if you take 5-MeO-DMT, even ketamine, and you actually apply it to neurons, nerve cells in a dish, so or in animal models, you actually see nerve cells growing. You actually see more function. You physically can see an increase in connections in the brain. So there is a very strong physical neural correlate of the effect of psychedelic. Now, you can't ask the neurons to meditate in a dish, so we can't test that one, right? But you can apply drugs to them. And by every count we have, the plasticity of these neurons absolutely increases by every metric we look at. Synapses, dendritic spines, neurite outgrowth, all of these things that we look at. But they are self-limited experiences. But like meditation, I would say these experiences are remembered. They don't go away. And so that's why they can become very useful therapeutic experiences if they're held in a safe container by somebody who understands how to direct someone. So if you have, for instance, a veteran who has trauma, when they listen to loud sounds, and you can help them create a different association and a more plastic brain, that is remembered. Those types of network changes persist. What the actual psychedelic state itself doesn't persist. And what that means is that the brain, during a psychedelic experience, and we've measured this, it's more functionally connected. It expresses more entropy. And then when the drug effect washes out, the brain kind of reorganizes to its normal waking state. But sometimes with an increase in those nerve connections. So there are people who do psychedelics where there's actually nerve growth in certain areas of their brain, and there is an increase in physical connections. I haven't seen that research done to that degree with meditators, but there is one study that actually looks at meditators and their brains and the brains of people who are age-matched controls who don't have a long meditation history, and it appears that the amount of gray matter, which is the actual nerve cells in the brain of the meditators, is larger in most of the regions of the brain they've looked at. So what we don't know is if the meditators actually have more birth of nerve cells, or if the people, as we age, we actually lose parts of our brain shrinks back from the skull as well. So what we don't know is if it's preserving the brains of the meditators or if it's actually resulting in an increase. But we do know they're different than the non-meditators.
I think I remember one of the studies, like earlier study, I'm not exactly remember the increase of thickness of the cortex for the meditation,
Yes, there
long-term
is.
meditation, like 4 months or 2 months regularly.
There
That's
is
also there.
actually.
Uh-huh.
And that's what I'm saying. Again, correlation is not causation. So I can't tell you why. I can't tell you what this exactly means. I can tell you that the correlation has been measured. So, one can take from that what you will. But the functional measures are definitely there. We definitely see differences in functional processing.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I have some more couple of questions. I'll email you later. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Ashok ji had raised the hand, and you have put your question in the chat box also. You can speak. Yeah.
Yeah. Namaste, thank you. So very quickly in 2 lines, I would thank, yes, spirituality, and I am fortunate to have seen the posting in one Gita group, I think by Naresh Chanerjee. So I just joined because it's very interesting and fascinating theme, Divyaji, and after seeing that, I saw some of your videos also. So coming to the question that I had written related to how artificial intelligence the way it is growing, will it help or harm our pathway to understand and be aware of the consciousness? And allow me also to add, you mentioned about uh, information with consciousness, that it stores a lot of information. And I was wondering, do you interchangeably use the word information with knowledge? And lastly, in one reference, you mentioned about emergence of consciousness, and that is a property of brain. So that way, brain being a physical entity, and somehow in my understanding a little bit, I somehow get the image that consciousness takes us away from the physical parameters. So that also means going beyond the physical space of the brain. So kindly reflect on this space. Thank you.
Ma'am, you're
Well,
mute.
Sorry, I was muted. I was going to say that that's a lot of questions, right? Those are some big questions. let me just say the quick thing first. I myself didn't say necessarily that consciousness was an emergent property of neural networks. I said that that's the prevailing theory with most neuroscientists, with most clinicians. They believe, and that is a somewhat reductionistic theory, right? They're saying that what you have is a material set of networks, and we observe that those networks are conscious, and therefore consciousness must arise as an emergent property from the complexity of those networks. So the more complex, the more conscious. That's that argument. And I'm actually making a different one. I'm saying actually that consciousness is more of a property of the universe, and we use the networks to bind information. You asked about the use of information. Information is not knowledge. It's, in fact, in the most physics sort of characterization, information is bits. It's like zeros and ones, or if you're looking at nucleic acids, which carry our genetic code, there are 4 kinds of bits, right? Each of the 4 base pairs. And the combination of these things is basically a code that can be combined in a way that it's a book for our genetic blueprint or other organisms on this planet and maybe elsewhere. There are also organic molecules we find in space, and some of them come to us from comets. You can actually sort of characterize this. Information in and of itself is not knowledge, though, right? It is just that there is something that can actually be the presence or the absence of that thing basically communicates that that physical thing exists. That is all information really is. It can be transmitted, it can be bound, it can be received, and then it can be processed and turned into a perception. And that's what our brains are so good at. It's bringing information in and using the abilities of that neural network to calculate and turn it into a percept. And when it's a visual perception, if we're walking around, it enables us to navigate in the universe without bumping into things. It allows animals to hunt, perhaps, right? Or to avoid being hunted. And so all of these things serve, these kinds of principles for us, but they're not identical. You could literally take everything that exists and you could break it down into bits of information. Every cell in your body, right? It contains all of your DNA, right? So each cell contains a blueprint for you. And so there's, even at the cellular level, there is so much information available. And so the argument I was making about information is that the total amount of information available in the universe is so enormous that there's no possibility that any organic brain or neural network we have ever encountered could bind that quantity of information and form one giant percept of what is happening. And it is possible, maybe, in a non-embodied form, when we are not incarnated. Perhaps the Atman can do this. I don't know, because I don't know what it is like, or have a memory of what it's like to not be incarnated. I don't know. So that ability to connect to the entire universe at once is something my brain doesn't even know how to hold this thought, but may be possible. Again, this is more in the domain of spiritual thinking. And so this is really the only thing I was trying to say. And then just to the idea of artificial intelligence, I don't think it's going to either help or hurt our understanding of consciousness per se. In fact, neuroscience and the neural correlates of consciousness have informed artificial intelligence research. So for those of you that are interested in kind of science and tech, we are now building faster computational chips. This is why NVIDIA has such a high market share, right? Because it's enabling AI to proceed with the kind of computational energy it requires. We're also building neuromorphic chips. Neuromorphic chips mean, so for instance, your brain takes about 20 watts to exist. That's about the power of a light bulb, an incandescent light bulb. That's crazy when you think about it, how little energy and how efficient this brain is. It doesn't calculate as fast as a machine, but it is incredibly efficient. And so there's an entire branch of computational science which tries to build chips that can process like the brain's architecture because the brain is so efficient. That's the neuromorphic computing. And so everything we learn about consciousness to some extent can inform the artificial intelligence scientists to help them on their journey. There's also a field of robotics called embodied robotics, where you have a robot, but even a Roomba vacuum cleaner, an autonomous vacuum cleaner is a type of robot. But the idea would be, can you actually take a neural network and embed it in a robot, an artificial neural network that we have created? And so I think most of the information goes the other way. It is not that AI is helping or harming us. It is that our experience of consciousness and our ability to quantify it in all the dimensions we have been discussing on this call are informing artificial intelligence and enabling them to do their work. Now, whether AI is going to be a problem for all of humanity is a completely different topic of conversation, and it's a very long one. But yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yes, no, thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Bijlani, sir, I request you to share your thoughts, please.
Sorry, where is
Thank you, Divya. This
Uh-huh.
has been a truly incredible session. Kept me riveted throughout, and I think same is true of much of the audience, because at the peak we had 25 participants, we still have 24. And this in spite of the fact that most of us are in this audience are from India, and at least for me, this is a time when if not actually asleep, I'm extremely sleepy, but yet I stayed awake throughout and still I'm wide awake. So you really kept our attention riveted, and it was a wonderful talk. I was just reminded of the qualities of youth that came across. I think David Clinton Pierce, he has talked about them, Joe Clinton Pierce. And one of them is energetic idealism and great expectations. So one can see that enthusiasm and the energy into what you thought is the ideal thing to know, and the passion with which you have pursued it is really possible only with that youthful vigor, where you have great expectations, dreams, and you are willing to pursue them. So that is what I observed in this throughout. And I must appreciate your courage, which again is goes with this energetic idealism, the courage to present a point of view which, as you yourself said, does not coincide with the mainstream scientific view, in spite of being a scientist yourself. And coming from a scientist of your stature, it really means a lot, because you may be on the fringes, you may be in the minority, but the fact that you are in the minority does not necessarily mean that you are wrong. And what I'm trying to hint at is which some of you who may not be medically qualified and may not be into biological sciences that much is essentially what the scientific view is, that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain, which means that somehow the release of the neurotransmitters in the neuronal circuits creates the electrochemical changes which you can pick up on the surface, and somehow these changes lead to consciousness. Now, that when you say that somehow lead to consciousness, itself expresses a degree of ignorance that we have. How is it that these neurochemical processes, which are concrete, physical, measurable, detectable, how is it that they lead to something subjective, which cannot be measured and which cannot be monitored by the instruments that we have? So this link between this physicochemical process and the non-physical subjective process which we call consciousness, that link is a black box. We hide it behind the word somehow it happens, but the fact is that the spiritual view in fact is quite different, and that is what you have tried to present, and you have presented a lot of evidence for it, which is what is of great value in today's era, when we are always looking for scientific evidence, if not proving something, at least being consistent with something. And that is all what science can actually do. It can give us data which is consistent with the spiritual worldview. The first to jump on this bandwagon were the physicists, when they came up with those findings in theoretical physics, which seemed to coincide with the spiritual worldview, and said, yes, the spiritual worldview is truly consistent with what we have found in physics. So that was the beginning. But now that neuroscientists and anesthesiologists are also coming around to that view, is truly sort of a great value in the modern era, when we talk about, we give so much value to what is scientific. The word scientific itself has become synonymous with whatever is good, true, valid, worthwhile, and so on. But none of these are actually the dictionary meanings of the word scientific. We just have got conditioned to thinking about the word scientific in that way. So when we say that the scientific view is, the mainstream scientific view is that the that consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. What is the other point of view to which now science is also taking us? The other point of view is the spiritual point of view, which is that there is a universal consciousness, and the brain is only a channelizer of that consciousness. It's not a generator, but it's a channelizer of that consciousness, and it all depends upon what fraction of that consciousness is channelized, which gives us the type of consciousness we have. And our consciousness, the animal consciousness, the consciousness of the large variety of animals that we have is quite different. And that is because we have different types of instruments to channelize a different fraction of that consciousness, different fraction, sometimes quantitatively and sometimes also qualitatively. So there can be these differences in what we are able to channelize and utilize rather than generate. Now, sometimes, when scientists try to argue, they say that, well, if there is no brain, you cannot have a consciousness. So it means that the brain is what is giving rise to the consciousness. So consciousness is an emergent property of the brain. The answer one can simply give is that look at a bulb. One can say that the bulb lights up because the bulb is the source of that light. If there's no bulb, there'll be no light. But then we all know that the bulb is not the source of that light. The source is the electricity, which we can't see. And therefore, just because if there's no bulb, there's no light, doesn't mean that the light resides in the bulb, or the bulb lights up because of that physical structure. So no amount of dissection of the bulb will actually reveal to us the secrets of electricity. In the same way, it's not the dissection of the brain that will give us those secrets. The secrets have to come from somewhere else, and science is now trying to get somewhere there at those secrets which the rishis worked out through a different mode of consciousness, a different mode of perception. So the science is somehow getting there indirectly, and at least coming to a point of view where what science is discovering is consistent with the spiritual worldview. So that is what you have tried to say in today's talk. And there were, of course, many gems that I picked up. For example, that you have seen the brain dissolve and reassemble. So the physical structure is there, and yet the instrument is not fit enough to channelize any fraction of the consciousness that is dissolution. And then since the process of anesthesia is reversible, you can find that the instrument is able to reassemble itself, and now it is able to function as that channelizer of the consciousness. And that when a person dies, does his consciousness persist? And then you hinted at that it really might. If we take an analogy from the internet, nothing that's on the internet is said to ever disappear. You can't really delete anything from the internet. When we delete something, it's only an illusion, just as death is an illusion. So death is not as real as we think, although they say that nothing is certain in the world except death and taxes. But death is not that certain, and that there's a degree of illusion that goes with the phenomenon of death. Then you talked about consciousness being non-local, which again, is something which is not only of academic interest, it has practical value. And Larry Dossey, who has been a pioneer in assembling all the work and himself doing some work and at least synthesis of knowledge available in the field of prayer and medicine, has said that, in fact, the modern era may be considered the era of mind-body medicine, which has now been a further progress on the era of physical medicine which preceded it. But then the era of mind-body medicine will give way very soon to the era of non-local medicine, which means that not only the patient's mind can influence the patient's body, the healer's mind can also influence the patient's body. So the healing intentions of the doctor or the healer do matter, and that will make it possible also to believe in faith healing and distance healing, because the transmission of consciousness does not require a medium, and it is irrespective of the distance between the healer and the patient. So it has practical implications, and again, there is data to support this. And we have some of these videos on the Yes Spirituality channel, on particularly on the relationship between prayer and healing, where these things have been discussed in greater detail. Then, you talked about the comparison between meditation and sleep, and the different phases of sleep, and the effect of the anesthetics. Now, the fact is that sleep is not a state of consciousness which can be completely neglected as something that we just go to sleep and the consciousness disappears. In fact, there are phases in sleep where we can be more conscious than we are, particularly during the dream sleep. The only thing is that dreams appear confused because of our ordinary level of consciousness. But the rishis have experienced that as the level of consciousness rises, it is during dreams that they have a much easier access to a much higher, wider, and deeper level of consciousness, at a level of consciousness where the concept of time disappears, so that they can visualize the past very clearly. Not only the past, they can also visualize the future quite clearly. And that is something which I'm sure the way you were talking, I can see that you have experienced some of these things because you have been practicing many of these things as a teenager, and it's been a long time since you were a teenager. So I'm sure you have experienced many of these things and you hinted at it. So I'm sure you can relate to it, and so can many others who have gone through this type of a journey. So with that, I would just say that it has really been an amazing experience, as much better than even expected. We expected a lot from you, and that is why we persisted with trying to get you in spite of a few postponements. But it has been much better than even expected. And not only my response, but the response of the audience also shows that I think although it will be difficult to get you again, it will be worth trying, and we'll keep trying. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So before we close, let me quickly inform that the recording of today's amazing session will be published on our YouTube channel, Yes Spirituality. I have shared the link in the chat box as well. And you can visit the channel and explore extensive content on yoga, education, spirituality, and related subjects like psychology and wellness. Divya ma'am, thank you so much once again for sharing your knowledge and your valuable time with all of us. And participants, thank you for being with us today. We'll close today's session now with a moment of peaceful silence. Namaste.